The colony world of Lyra 9 was an isolated outpost, nestled on the fringes of the known universe. It was a place where science and exploration held sway over the day-to-day struggles of survival. The small research station Obsidian Horizon was home to a select team of scientists, engineers, and astronomers tasked with investigating anomalies in deep space. Among them was Dr. Evelyn Riker, a seasoned astrophysicist whose expertise in wave signals made her an invaluable asset to the colony. It was a quiet evening when the signal first appeared. Riker was working late, scanning data from the station's array of telescopes, when she noticed something unusual, a subtle rhythmic pulse cutting through the static of space. At first, it seemed like a glitch, but there was something too deliberate about its frequency, its repetition. A message. She leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowing as she adjusted the filters on her monitor, isolating the signal. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The waveform was complex, yet strangely familiar. Not the harsh, dissonant static of alien communication, nor the typical patterns of cosmic radiation. This was different, as though the signal was meant to be heard, like a song drifting through the vast emptiness of space. A melody, soft, haunting, and far too clear for comfort. Riker's heart quickened. It sounded human. She ran the signal through the station's decoders. As the data rolled in, the melody began to evolve. It wasn't just a song, it was layered. Beneath the delicate notes, rhythmic pulses began to form, like the beat of a heart. And then, just as she was about to dismiss it as an anomaly, she heard something she couldn't ignore. A voice, faint, but unmistakably human. "We are calling you." The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Riker replayed the segment, adjusting the frequency and amplifying the voice. The words came clearer now, but their meaning was fragmentary, broken. It wasn't a message from an alien species, as she had feared. It wasn't even a message from a distant civilization lost to the depths of space. This was human. The voice spoke of something ancient, something from a past that should have been forgotten, yet it carried an urgency that could not be ignored. "Where are we?" The voice faded into a series of unintelligible whispers, like an echo too distant to reach. The static continued, blending with the haunting melody, as if the signal itself was trying to convey a sense of desperation. Riker's fingers hovered over the console. She had to know more. This was a breakthrough, something no one had ever expected to find. A message from beyond the stars, from human beings who had somehow slipped through the cracks of time. Her mind raced. Could it be a recording, a long-forgotten transmission from Earth's distant past? Or was it something far more sinister, a trick of the universe, manipulating the very fabric of reality itself? She ran another scan, trying to pinpoint the origin of the signal. It didn't seem to come from a known source. There were no stars, no planets, no space stations in the immediate vicinity. It was coming from the void, from the dark abyss between galaxies. Dr. Riker felt a chill creep down her spine. There was something profound in that silence, something otherworldly, and yet, the more she listened, the more it became clear that the signal was calling to her, to the station, to humanity itself. What it was asking, she wasn't sure, but she was determined to find out. She sent a message to the rest of the crew, requesting immediate analysis. There was no turning back now. The signal was just the beginning. The questions it raised, questions of human history, of forgotten civilizations, were only the start of a mystery that could unravel the very fabric of time itself. The following day, the atmosphere at Obsidian Horizon had shifted. What began as an isolated curiosity was quickly spiraling into a mystery that demanded answers. Dr. Riker stood before the main console in the communications room, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the signal filters once more. The haunting melody from the previous evening still played softly in the background, looping endlessly, but now it was different. As she listened closely, the voices had grown clearer, no longer mere whispers lost in static. The voices had become distinct, speaking in languages she couldn't recognize, yet their tone was undeniably human. "We are waiting. Can you hear us?" The words were fragmented, like they had been pulled from a dream. Dr. Riker frowned, leaning in closer to the console. She quickly initiated a translation algorithm, trying to decode the garbled speech. As the words began to form, she realized with growing unease that they weren't just ancient. These were voices from a time long before humanity had even reached the stars. The accents were archaic, and the languages were foreign, yet somehow they felt familiar, like echoes of Earth's earliest history. The voices spoke of a disaster, of destruction, and a warning, a cataclysm that reached across the centuries, yet one that seemed eerily tied to the present. The signal pulsed again, louder now, as if pressing against her consciousness. "They are coming. You must stop them." Dr. Riker's pulse quickened. The urgency in the voices was unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was sending this signal was in distress. She had never encountered anything like it before. The voices seemed to bleed into one another, some pleading, others demanding, but all were united by a common theme. Time itself was unraveling. She replayed the message again, her mind racing with possibilities. Could this be an echo from humanity's past? Perhaps an old Earth distress signal that had been lost in space for centuries? But then, why were the voices speaking with such immediacy? They couldn't possibly know what had happened in the intervening years, unless they were somehow still alive, but that idea seemed impossible. The crew had gathered in the main hall of the station for a briefing. Riker shared her findings, but she saw the skepticism in their eyes. Dr. Marcus Vale, a historian who had recently joined the team, was the first to speak. "You're saying these are human voices from Earth's past?" he asked, incredulous. "I'm saying these are voices," Riker replied, her gaze fixed on the screen. "Human voices from a time we should have forgotten, and they're asking for help." Vale adjusted his glasses, clearly uneasy. "I've heard stories, legends about ancient humanity's reach into the stars. Some of the more fringe theories suggest that we weren't the first to explore space, that there were others, lost civilizations that somehow vanished. But this..." His voice trailed off as he glanced at the distorted faces on the screen. "This is something different." The room grew quiet, each member of the crew digesting the enormity of what they were hearing. It wasn't just the ancient past speaking from the void, it was a warning, an urgent call for something to be done. Riker felt it too, the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. These voices were not random fragments. They were linked by something deep, something ancient. And they were reaching out now, in this very moment, for a reason. Riker stood up abruptly, her mind made up. She wasn't just going to analyze the signal. She had to understand it, unravel it completely. The history of humanity, lost in time, was somehow tied to this moment, and the consequences of ignoring it could be catastrophic. "We need to find the source," Riker said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "This signal isn't just a relic, it's a message, and I think it's meant for us." Dr. Riker spent the next few days poring over the signal, her thoughts consumed by the mysterious voices. They had spoken of destruction, of something coming, of a rupture in time itself. The weight of their words haunted her every moment. If the signal truly was a warning from the past, then what had happened to these people? What had caused them to send a message across the centuries, across the very fabric of time? It was late on the third night when the door to the communications room opened with a soft hiss, and Dr. Marcus Vale stepped inside, his face drawn with concern. Riker barely acknowledged him, too focused on the screen before her, which displayed an increasingly complex sequence of coded signals. "We need to talk," Vale said, his voice firm. Riker didn't look up, but she could hear the urgency in his tone. She knew what he was about to say. "You've been studying it too, haven't you?" she asked without turning. "The temporal fracture." Vale nodded. He took a slow step forward, studying the signal on the screen. I've been looking through ancient archives, pulling old texts. What I'm seeing here isn't just an anomaly in space. It's something far older, something we should never have disturbed. Riker finally turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? The signal. It's human. It's calling out for help. It is, Vale admitted, his expression grim. But it's not just a message. It's a warning, a call from a time we thought was lost forever. And the voices you're hearing, they're part of something much bigger. Vale paused, collecting his thoughts. He took a deep breath, then continued, I've studied historical accounts, especially the fringe theories. There were rumors, whispers from the earliest days of humanity's reach into space. The ancient records mention something called the temporal fracture, a cosmic event that occurred long before we ever set foot on other worlds. Riker frowned, confusion knitting her brow. The temporal fracture, I've never heard of it. What does it have to do with the signal? Vale stepped closer, lowering his voice as though he feared being overheard. The temporal fracture was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to bend time itself, to manipulate the flow of history. Humanity's earliest spacefaring ancestors, before our recorded history began, experimented with something called the chrononexus, a device that could bridge the past, present, and future. They wanted to rewrite time, to control it. Riker's pulse quickened. So these voices, they're from that time? From the first humans? Vale nodded gravely. Yes. And they've been lost in the void ever since. When the chrononexus failed, it created a rift in time, a fracture that spread out across the universe, affecting everything in its path. The collapse scattered human consciousness, leaving fragments trapped in time, some of them reaching forward, others backward. The result is what you're hearing now. The signal is just a byproduct of that fracture. These voices, they aren't just echoes. They're remnants of humanity itself, scattered across the ages. Riker's thoughts raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. If Vale's theory was correct, then the signal wasn't a coincidence. The temporal fracture wasn't some distant, irrelevant event. It was tied to everything they were experiencing now. The rift in time was beginning to bleed into the present. So these voices, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, they're trapped. They're trying to warn us, to stop whatever is coming. Vale met her gaze. Exactly. And if we don't act, that same fracture will tear through the fabric of time again. The voices you're hearing are just the beginning. The rift is growing. Whatever caused it, it's coming back, and it will consume everything in its path. A cold shiver ran down Riker's spine. The temporal fracture had never truly healed. It had only been waiting, building, biding its time. Now it was waking up, and it was calling them. I need to know more, Riker said, determination hardening her features. We have to stop it. We can't let it happen again. Vale hesitated for a moment before answering. I've been researching the location of the original chrononexus. If we can find it, we might have a chance to reverse the damage, but it's going to be dangerous. The rift is pulling at everything, and there's no telling what we'll encounter. Riker stood, her resolves solidifying. Then we have to find it. We don't have any choice. The future of humanity, and perhaps time itself, was in their hands. The voices were calling, and it was up to them to answer. The days that followed were a blur of preparations and frantic activity. The station buzzed with tension, and the air was thick with a sense of impending disaster. Dr. Riker and Dr. Vale worked tirelessly to track the origins of the signal, following every lead, cross-referencing ancient texts and astronomical data. Yet, the more they investigated, the more the mystery deepened. Every clue they uncovered pointed to something far beyond their understanding. A temporal anomaly, a cosmic fracture, and a human history that had been fractured and lost to time. On the fifth night, it happened again. The voices returned, but this time, they were different. They no longer spoke in fragmented, desperate pleas. They were clearer, more insistent, almost as if they were growing stronger with each passing moment. Riker was sitting alone in the communications room when the signal began to pulse. The eerie melody filled the space once more, accompanied by the unmistakable rhythm of human voices, now sharp and clear. "Time is breaking," one voice said, its tone haunting and final. "The fracture is real. It will consume you all." The words sent a shiver down Riker's spine. She replayed the segment, listening carefully. The voices weren't just warnings now, they were directing her. It was as if the voices knew exactly what was happening, where to look, and what needed to be done. Before she could process it further, something strange occurred. Objects began to materialize within the communications room, pieces of the past, long forgotten and weathered by time. First, a faded book appeared on the table in front of her. Its pages, yellowed with age, were filled with texts in languages she couldn't immediately decipher. Then, an old photograph of a family, long lost to history, appeared beside it, its edges frayed. Riker stared at the photograph, her heart racing. The people in the photo were dressed in an era that was ancient, even by Earth's standards. She recognized something, or rather, someone, among them, a man with a familiar face. He looked like an ancestor, someone from the earliest spacefaring days. She had seen his likeness in records, but this was impossible. The man in the photograph should not have existed in this timeline. As her mind reeled, the station's lights flickered, and the hum of the power systems fluctuated. Suddenly, the voices were all around her, louder than before. "Find the nexus, find the fracture before it finds you," another voice urged. The objects around her began to warp and distort, flickering in and out of existence, as if the very fabric of time was tearing at the seams. Panicking, Riker activated the emergency alert. The station was starting to destabilize, its systems malfunctioning as the temporal rift grew stronger. She knew they didn't have much time left. She rushed to the main control room, where Vale and the rest of the crew were already on high alert. The screens were filled with images of anomalies, time distortions ripping through the fabric of the station, causing the past and present to bleed together. People appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye, figures from long-dead histories materializing briefly before disappearing into thin air. Objects and technologies, some older than humanity's first interstellar voyage, floated in and out of existence. Vale met her at the console. "It's happening faster than we anticipated," he said grimly. "The rift is collapsing time itself. We need to find the source now, or the whole station will be consumed." Riker took a deep breath, her mind racing. The only place they could go was the planet's surface, the place where the original chrononexus had been buried, forgotten for centuries. The rift was drawing them toward it, pulling them into the past and present, forcing them to confront what they had unleashed. "We have to leave now," Riker said, her voice unwavering despite the chaos around them. "The Nexus is the only way to stop this. If we don't act, the rift will destroy everything." The crew scrambled into action, preparing for a journey that would take them deep into the heart of the fracture, into the very source of the temporal collapse. As the station's systems continued to glitch and falter, Riker felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. The convergence of past and future had begun, and there would be no turning back. The descent to Lyra 9's surface was a turbulent one. The station's systems, already destabilized by the growing rift, had to be manually overridden to guide the ship through the chaotic atmosphere. Riker gripped the armrest, her mind swirling with thoughts of the chrononexus. According to Vale's research, the nexus was buried deep beneath a forgotten temple in the planet's northern hemisphere, a place untouched by human exploration until now. They had no idea what they would find when they arrived, but Riker was certain that it was their only hope to close the rift and stop the time fracture from consuming everything. The landscape below was desolate, wind-swept plains broken by jagged mountains and deep ravines. The storm clouds swirling above the surface seemed to pulse with unnatural energy, the sky alive with violent flashes of light. The fracture was already bleeding into the atmosphere, and Riker could feel its presence even through the reinforced hull of the shuttle. Time itself seemed to ripple, bending and warping around them as they descended, like the very air was trying to tear itself apart. When the shuttle touched down, the ground seemed to tremble beneath them. The planet's surface had long been abandoned, its ruins reclaimed by nature, but there was no mistaking the power radiating from beneath the Earth. The chrono nexus was close, its helm almost inaudible under the storm's roar, but it was there, alive with the resonance of an ancient energy that seemed to vibrate through Riker's bones. The team quickly disembarked, the harsh winds battering them as they moved toward the ruins of the temple. As they approached, Riker felt something stir within her, a sensation she couldn't quite place, an aching pull toward the structure, as though something deep inside her recognized this place. She had seen it in her dreams, in flashes of memories that didn't belong to her. It was as if the signal, the voices, had been calling her to this moment, to this very spot. The temple itself was an imposing structure, a crumbling monument to a long-forgotten civilization. Its massive stone doors had long since fallen away, leaving only the jagged remnants of what had once been a grand entrance. The walls were covered in strange symbols, pictographs and inscriptions that seemed to move and shift when Riker glanced at them, like they were written in a language that transcended time itself. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ancient dust and decay, yet there was a pulsing energy that filled the space. At the center of the chamber, partially buried under centuries of rubble, stood the chrono nexus. It was a complex array of metallic structures, shimmering with an iridescent glow that seemed to resonate with the surrounding air. The nexus was beautiful and terrifying all at once, a device of unimaginable power, capable of manipulating the very flow of time. Riker approached cautiously, feeling the weight of its energy drawing her closer. As she reached out, her fingers brushed the surface of the nexus. A surge of electricity shot through her body, and for a brief moment, she felt the pull of time itself, as though it was reaching out to her, begging her to listen, to understand. Then, the resonance intensified. A deep hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and into Riker's chest. The voices from the signal flooded her mind, their words now clear and unmistakable. "We, are you, too late. The fracture is irreversible." The voices weren't just distant echoes now, they were inside her, all around her. The resonance from the nexus had somehow linked her to the past, to the people who had once wielded its power. Their warnings, their pleas, were coming through more clearly than ever before. They had made a mistake, an unforgivable one, and now, the fracture they had caused was spiraling out of control. Riker's head throbbed with the intensity of the connection. She could see flashes of history, the rise and fall of an ancient civilization, their attempts to manipulate time, their eventual destruction. They had reached too far, tried to bend time to their will, and in doing so, had torn the very fabric of existence apart. "The fracture is breaking through," the voices continued, their tone laced with sorrow. "Stop it, or we all cease to exist." Riker staggered back, the weight of their words pressing down on her. The reality of what she was facing hit her like a freight train. The fracture wasn't just a problem for the past, it was consuming everything, erasing history, erasing the future. If they couldn't close the nexus, the timeline would shatter, and there would be nothing left. The team stood frozen, the gravity of the situation sinking in. It was now or never. Riker turned to Vale, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to stop it," she said, her hands shaking as she approached the nexus once more. "We have to fix what they broke." The room around them seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the nexus, a deep, unyielding rhythm that reverberated through every fiber of Riker's being. The hum was no longer just a sound, it was a sensation, a pressure against her chest as if time itself were tightening its grip on the world. The fractures in the air were growing, visible now, swirling like ripples on the surface of water, pulling everything toward them. Riker felt the weight of the voices still pressing in on her mind, their words urgent and desperate, but with a faint undertone of hopelessness. The destruction they had caused was irreversible. The fabric of time was ripping apart. If the Nexus wasn't deactivated, everything, past, present, and future, would collapse into nothingness. And yet, even now, the device still hummed with that strange, almost mesmerizing energy, beckoning her to make the impossible choice. Vale stood beside her, scanning the Nexus with a mixture of awe and fear. He looked at Riker, his face pale beneath the harsh light. It's beyond anything we've imagined," he said quietly, almost to himself. "To think they once believed they could control time. This could be their final act of defiance." Riker swallowed, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She didn't need to ask what Vale meant. The ancient civilization, those who had first discovered the power of the chrononexus, had thought they could manipulate time. But instead, they had fractured it, destroyed the timeline, leaving echoes of themselves trapped in the void, forever trying to fix what they had broken. She turned back to the Nexus, her hands trembling. Every part of her wanted to reach out, to connect with the device, but something inside her warned against it. The Nexus had caused so much destruction already. Who was to say what would happen if they tried to reverse it? "We can't just shut it down like any other machine," Riker murmured, more to herself than to Vale. "We need to stabilize the rift before it spreads any further. If we don't, everything ends," Vale finished for her. His voice was heavy with dread. She nodded, eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the Nexus. The voices were growing louder, more insistent. She could feel them now, no longer just fragmented echoes, but complete and whole entities, desperate to be heard. "Listen to us," one voice cried, its tone filled with anguish. "We were once like you. You must understand, we never meant for it to end like this." Riker closed her eyes, trying to focus on the task ahead. She couldn't let herself be consumed by the voices, no matter how powerful their pull. She had to think clearly, to make a decision that would save them all. The Nexus could be the answer, or it could be the final blow to the already unstable reality. Taking a deep breath, Riker reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the Nexus. The moment she touched it, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently. The entire chamber seemed to distort, stretching and warping in an impossible dance of reality. The air shimmered like heat rising off a desert, and the room flickered between different moments in time, ancient civilizations, futuristic cities, the same faces shifting through countless ages. "Stabilize the temporal vector," Riker commanded, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to isolate the core." Vale stepped forward, his hands moving quickly over the nearby console, activating the ancient controls built into the Nexus. The device reacted violently, as though recognizing the human touch, but Riker held firm. The voices screamed in protest, their panic rising as they realized what was happening. "Please, you don't understand," another voice cried, its tone frantic. "You cannot undo what was done. It will break you. It will consume you." But Riker was resolute. She could hear the terror in their voices, but she knew what had to be done. They had come too far to back out now. The Nexus hummed louder, the resonance building until it was almost deafening. Time itself seemed to buckle, and Riker could feel the very edges of reality beginning to slip away. She pressed her hand harder against the surface of the device, focusing every ounce of her will on stabilizing the rift. She wasn't just manipulating the machine, she was fighting against the very fabric of time itself. With a violent jolt, the device responded. The Nexus flared brightly, the energy surrounding it shifting in patterns that almost seemed to resemble the flow of time itself, past, present, future, all converging into one singular point. For a brief, breathtaking moment, Riker felt the weight of centuries on her shoulders. The entire history of humanity, its triumphs and its mistakes, was laid bare before her. But it was not a vision of glory. It was a warning. Then, with a blinding flash, the Nexus released its power. Time itself snapped back into alignment, the rift beginning to close. The voices faded into silence, their echoes vanishing as the device's hum quieted. But Riker knew the battle wasn't over. The fracture had been stabilized, but the consequences of their actions, of tampering with the flow of time, had only just begun to reveal themselves. She turned to Vale, her expression grave. "We've bought ourselves time, but this isn't over," she said quietly. "Not yet." The silence that followed the Nexus's power surge was unsettling. The pulse of energy that had once threatened to tear time apart had faded, but something else lingered in the air, an oppressive weight, like an unseen presence watching them from the shadows. Riker stood still, her hand still resting on the surface of the now dormant Nexus, feeling the tremor of its residual energy vibrating through her fingertips. The voices, the echoes from another time, were gone, but they had left something behind. Vale, who had been carefully monitoring the readouts on the console, looked up sharply. His eyes widened in alarm. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Riker glanced toward him, her brow furrowing. There was something wrong, something she could feel deep in her chest. A deep, unexplainable pulse, like the heartbeat of the planet itself, seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath their feet. The walls of the temple shuddered, a low, grinding noise emanating from deep within the earth. "It's not over," Riker whispered. Her voice barely reached above the rumble of the ground as the planet's core seemed to shift. Before Vale could respond, the air in the temple seemed to warp. The space around them began to distort, rippling like a mirage. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of them. It was tall, its form indistinct at first, like a shadow from the deepest void, but then it solidified, an entity made of darkness and light, its shape flickering between solid and ephemeral, as though it were not entirely bound by time or space. Its eyes were the most unsettling part. Not eyes, exactly, but two bright, glowing orbs that burned with an unnatural fire. They focused on Riker with a piercing intensity that sent a chill down her spine. It was aware of her, aware of them both, and the weight of its presence pressed down on her like a physical force. Vale took a step back, his voice low but filled with fear. "What is that?" Riker's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of the entity before them. The Nexus had stabilized the fracture, but this being, this creature, was something different. It didn't belong in their reality. It was older, far older, and yet, it was bound to this moment in time, an apex of the rupture they had caused. "It's not from our time," Riker said, her words barely escaping her lips. She could feel the entity's gaze piercing her, as if it were reading her thoughts. Her mind began to cloud with visions, flickering images of an ancient universe, of beings far more advanced than humanity, of a time before the existence of space or stars, before reality itself had taken shape. The entity's voice filled her mind, its tone deep and resonant, like the sound of 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You have tampered with forces beyond your comprehension. You have destabilized the boundary between worlds." Riker stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you? What do you want?" The entity's form seemed to shift, its figure rippling like a liquid mirror. "I am the consequence of your actions. I am the fracture that runs through time, the echo of the void that exists between all realities. I am what happens when you reach too far, when you tear open the fabric of existence." The words sent a wave of dread through Riker. This being, this entity, was no simple manifestation of energy or corrupted time. It was something far more dangerous, something born from the very mistake they had tried to correct. The Nexus had not merely caused the fracture, it had awakened something ancient, something that had slumbered in the folds of reality for eons. "You sought to undo the rift," the entity continued, its voice growing colder. "But in doing so, you have invited the end. The fracture is not merely a mistake, it is a gateway, and you have opened it." Riker's mind raced. The Nexus had connected them to a timeline, but it had also unlocked something far worse. They hadn't just stabilized the rift. They had unintentionally opened a door to an entity beyond the fabric of time itself. The rift was no longer just a tear in time. It was a portal to something ancient, something that should never have been awakened. She took a step back, her thoughts a whirlwind. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, trying to control her fear. The entity's glowing eyes narrowed. "I do not want anything from you. You have already given me everything I require. The gateway is open. Time is no longer bound. Your world will be consumed, and the echo of the void will spread." The air in the temple grew heavy, the walls vibrating with a low hum as the ground beneath them trembled. The entity's presence seemed to spread, filling the chamber with its unnatural energy. Riker could feel the very air warping around her, as though the laws of physics were bending to its will. "You cannot stop it," the entity intoned, its voice now a low, insistent whisper in her mind. "You are already too late." The last remnants of hope began to fade as Riker realized the terrible truth. They had not just unleashed a rift. They had drawn the attention of an entity that existed beyond time itself. The question was no longer how to stop the fracture, but how to survive it. And in that moment, Riker understood. They were facing something far worse than they could have ever imagined. Something that could unravel everything they knew, leaving nothing but the dark, empty void in its wake. The weight of the entity's presence felt suffocating, its power radiating through the very fabric of the temple. Riker stood frozen, her mind racing to process the impossible truth. The rift wasn't just a tear in time, it was a doorway, and they had unwittingly opened it. The entity, born from the deepest fractures of reality, had already begun to spread, a force of unimaginable power that could erase everything. Earth, the station, the future, it would all be consumed by this void. Vale's voice cut through the chaos. "We can't fight it directly. Whatever this is, it's beyond our capabilities." Riker nodded, the cold grip of despair settling over her. But then, as if some distant, forgotten part of her mind sparked to life, a glimmer of hope emerged. She thought back to the Nexus, the core of the temporal rift. It had been designed to manipulate the very flow of time itself. Could it be used again? Could it be repurposed to close the gateway, to undo the damage they had caused? The entity's form flickered in and out of existence, its massive presence watching them with an eerie calm. Its voice resonated in Riker's mind, a constant hum that pressed against her thoughts. "You cannot undo what has been done. Time is unmade. Your world is already lost." Riker's heart pounded, but something in her steadied her. Humanity had faced impossible odds before. The echoes, the voices they had heard through the Nexus, had shown her the desperate, broken remnants of civilizations that had fallen. And yet, they had left behind a message, a warning to those who would listen. Could they, too, leave an echo? Could they make a stand against the impossible? "Maybe not," Riker murmured, her voice barely audible. "But humanity can adapt. We've always found a way, even when the odds are stacked against us." Vale looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "What are you thinking?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, Riker turned toward the Nexus. It was still pulsing faintly, its energy a source of both fear and potential. She remembered the way the Nexus had connected her to the past, how it had revealed glimpses of history, of the people who had once wielded its power. There had to be a way to use it, to turn it against the entity, to force it back into the void from which it came. "Humanity's greatest strength is its resilience," Riker said, more to herself than to Vale. "The ability to change, to adapt, even when faced with extinction." She reached out once more, her hand trembling as she pressed it against the surface of the Nexus. The energy surged beneath her touch, the connection snapping into place like the final link in a chain. The entity's voice shrieked in her mind, furious at the intrusion. "You cannot defy me. I am beyond time, beyond your comprehension." But Riker focused, pushing her fear aside. She visualized the rift, the fractured timeline, and the key to its undoing. The Nexus wasn't just a device of destruction, it was also a key to repair, to bind, to restore. If she could channel its power just right, if she could force the entity into a temporal loop, she might be able to lock it away, to trap it outside of time, where it couldn't hurt anyone. She activated the Nexus with a single thought. The device's pulse grew stronger, the light around it blinding as it hummed with unimaginable power. A wave of energy shot outward, creating a vortex that spiraled around the entity. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself hung suspended in a single breath. The entity writhed, its form breaking apart and reforming in response to the Nexus's grip. But it wasn't enough to hold it back. The entity screamed in fury, but Riker refused to relent. "You are not the only one who can manipulate time," she shouted. "Humanity's will cannot be undone." With those words, a final burst of energy erupted from the Nexus, flooding the chamber with an overwhelming light. The walls of the temple cracked and shattered, but the entity, unable to resist the pull of the temporal loop, was drawn into the vortex. Its screams echoed through the chamber as it was pulled into the void, its form dissolving into the rift, leaving nothing behind. For a long moment, there was silence. The Nexus powered down, its light fading as the temporal energy stabilized. The rift had closed. The entity was gone. Riker fell to her knees, exhaustion overwhelming her. Vale was beside her almost immediately, helping her up. He looked at the now quiet temple, the air still and heavy. "Did we do it?" Vale asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Riker nodded, staring at the now dormant Nexus. It had taken everything, every ounce of strength, every last bit of their will, to seal the rift. But they had done it. The timeline had been restored, the void had been sealed, humanity had survived. But even as the adrenaline drained from her, Riker couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes of this event would reverberate through time forever. The Nexus might have closed the rift, but they had left a scar, and somewhere, deep in the fabric of the universe, the entity's presence would linger, a reminder of how fragile time truly was. As the storm outside began to subside, Riker stood tall, her mind racing with thoughts of what was next. They had survived this day, but humanity's journey was far from over. They had saved the timeline, but they had also learned an undeniable truth. Time was never truly theirs to control. The echo of humanity's resilience would carry on, but at what cost?